Hello, I'm Natasha. Welcome back to my channel. Today I return to discuss the country of Russia. Here in the UK, a well-known political figure, Nigel Farage, has accused the West of antagonising Russia or poking the bear. And I believe that he is right in his assessment of this. So in today's video, I want to discuss this series of events which I believe Russia would deem as antagonising. Firstly, in 2008 at NATO's Bucharest summit, NATO welcomed Ukraine and Georgia's aspirations for membership of NATO. The declaration led to cracks between the US, who wanted to admit both countries, and France and Germany, who feared that this would antagonise Russia. I think France and Germany were right on this point. Russia saw Georgia and Ukraine's membership as a threat to their security, and I have other videos where I describe why Russia would see the NATO alliance approaching its borders as a threat, principally because Russia does not see NATO as defensive, given the events that transpired in the former Yugoslavia and then Iraq. NATO's expansion eastwards was also regarded by Russia as a security threat, or red line. The next antagonising situation came to take place in 2014 with the West's support for the Maidan coup. At the time, President Yanukovych was in power, and he was the elected president of Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin did state that the 2014 uprising that saw the former Ukrainian President Yanukovych forced from office was the result of a coup orchestrated by the US and supported by Washington's European allies. External actors have always played an important role in shaping and supporting civil society in Ukraine through agencies like the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, and US Agency for International Development, whose Kiev headquarters were in the same compound as the US Embassy. US officials saw an opportunity with the Maidan protest. Just 2 months before they broke out, the NED's then president wrote that the opportunities are considerable and there are important ways that Washington could help. In practice, this meant funding groups like New Citizen, which the Financial Times reported as playing a big role in getting the protests up and running. Journalist Mark Amis discovered that the organisation had received hundreds of thousands of dollars from US democracy promotion initiatives, clearly funding opposition groups in Ukraine and thereby undermining the constitution of Ukraine would anger the Russians. Although it is interesting to note that at the time after the coup, Russia was willing to work with the new leader of Ukraine. Russia stated that all it wanted for Ukraine was peace and calm, and that they were ready to cooperate with the new people in power. This is what Vladimir Putin stated in an interview with CNBC following the coup. I think this was a remarkably balanced response from the Russians. The next trigger for Russia was the 2014 sanctions which were imposed on Russia by the West. This was in response to Russia's annexation of Crimea. As of 2014, Russia's finance minister announced that the sanctions had cost Russia $40 billion, with another $100 billion loss due to a decrease in the price of oil in 2014. Clearly, this would annoy the Russians, the imposition of these sanctions which directly affected Russia's economy. Obviously, people are going to come back to me and argue, well, Russia annexed Crimea, so it deserves these sanctions. But I don't really see the merit in sanctions as a tool to reach a meaningful diplomatic solution, which is ultimately what is needed. Furthermore, Russia had its own reasons for annexing Crimea, such as the self-determination of the Crimean people and the results of the referendum which took place in 2014, where officials say 95.5% of Crimean voters backed joining Russia. Russia saw this as a valid reason for annexation. The sanctions also ignore the referendum that took place in Crimea in 1991 before the collapse of the Soviet Union, where the Crimean Oblast overwhelmingly voted for Crimea to be a separate participant of the new Union Treaty, which would have meant that Crimea would have been a sovereign subject of the renewed USSR and separate from the Ukrainian SSR. The West, however, conveniently ignores this historical fact, and there seems to be no media attention on this important referendum. The next antagonising event for the Russians was the West choosing to ignore the plight of Russian speakers in Ukraine. Following the coup in 2014, there was an ongoing conflict between the Donetsk region and the government of Ukraine, a conflict which led to approximately 14,000 people dying in the region between 2014 and early 2023. For the West to be a defender of human rights and freedom, while at the same time ignoring the plight of so many ethnic Russians, this would be a bone of contention for the Russian government. The final aggravation for Russia was the failure of the West to fully support the implementation of the Minsk agreements. These Minsk agreements were supposed to end the fighting between Donetsk and the government of Ukraine, and France and Germany did declare support for these agreements. However, the Minsk agreements were never fully implemented, and there were almost daily violations of the terms. It is interesting to note that after Russia launched its special military operation, Angela Merkel and François Hollande stated that they had never intended to satisfy the agreements. So clearly, NATO's expansion eastwards is not the only point of concern for the Russians, and since 2008 they have been repeatedly aggravated by the West, which has led them to launch their special military operation. One can only hope that once this operation ends and the spheres of influence between the West and Russia are agreed, that this will put an end to the West's hostilities against Russia.